Hello, good evening or good afternoon, depending on where you are, and welcome to the fifth conversation in our Spring Speaker Series, Artists Envisioning a Green New Deal, which is an extension of Climate Change Theater Action 2021, taking place this fall. And today we'll be focusing on the energy transition. My name is Chantal Bilodeau. I'm the artistic director of the Arctic Cycle. And if you hear some rumbling in the background, it's because there's a storm moving through where I am, and hopefully the electricity will hold. Feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. There is a live transcript button available at the bottom of your Zoom screen if you need live captioning. And I want to take a moment to say thank you to the Brabson Library and Educational Foundation for making this event possible. I also want to acknowledge that the Arctic Cycle is located on the traditional lands of the Lenape people. And I want to pay my respect to them and other Indigenous caretakers of these lands and waters, and to their elders who have lived here, who live here now, and who will live here in the future. And I extend this respect to all Indigenous people. And now I would like to introduce my colleague, Thomas, and Thomas will be moderating the conversation today. And later on, you'll meet my other colleague, Julia, who will help with the Q&A.
Thank you, Chantal, and hi, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for joining us. My name is Thomas Peterson, and I'm an artistic associate with the Arctic Cycle, and I'll be moderating this conversation today on the energy transition and how artists can engage with it. And a profound transformation of the means by which we power our lives is at the core of a Green New Deal and other systemic societal re-envisionings in response to the climate crisis, because the vast majority of global energy consumption is still powered by fossil fuels, gravely harming human health and intensifying climate impacts. And across forms and mediums, artists are increasingly engaging with the climate crisis, making work informed by the dramatic changes that we are all experiencing. However, the arts have perhaps been slower to engage with the energy transition as a specific subset of climate and the changes that we're seeing, despite the centrality of energy to the climate problem. And in thinking about this panel and designing it, we've thought a lot about how fossil fuels maintain a relatively strong place in the cultural and narrative landscape, whether that's the image of the coal miner or the enduring political power of narratives about fossil fuel jobs, narratives that often reflect a vanishingly small number of actual workers. And in contrast to that, it seems as though renewable energy occupies a marginal narrative and cultural space, or at least relatively. And when I spoke to a friend recently about this panel, a writer who's outside the climate and environmental advocacy world, she remarked that when she thinks about coal, she thinks about people. And when she thinks about solar, she thinks about technology, about the panels. And this seems like a problem. And so part of the genesis for this is to gather as artists, as renewable energy advocates, to think about what we can do to solve this problem. So we're here to discuss how artists can support, reflect on, and explore the transition to clean and renewable sources of energy. But as this is a panel in anticipation of the programming this fall as part of Climate Change Theater Action's 2021 season, we're going to begin with a reading of one of the plays commissioned for Climate Change Theater Action 2021, a short play called The Deal by Javad Alipour that I think will serve as a useful foregrounding to this conversation. It's a narrative engagement with perhaps not the energy transition, but the energy past and status quo, or energy transitions of the past. So I'd like to introduce Julius Wade, the actor who will be reading The Deal by Javad Alipour. And Julius, I will let you take it away.
Great, thank you, Thomas, and hello and welcome to everyone. Okay. This is a story about a deal. It's the deal at the heart of the oil industry. It's the deal that used to go like this. Western colonial oil concession, profits in New York, London, or Amsterdam, a cut for a local warlord, guaranteed production, Iraq, Nigeria, Mexico, pliant population, utter destruction of forests and seas. It has a few changes now. Centers of accumulation shift. Sovereign wealth funds are established, but the principles remain. It could be a fictional story, a play or film, music and lights. It's got everything, backstabbing, politics, love interests, but it's not. You know how it ends, because it ends with the world as it actually is. This is the story of a little known but real man called Abdullah Tariqi. He was, for a few years, the Saudi Minister of Oil. He helped to fund OPEC. He died a rich old man in Lebanon, but in the early 1960s, he was something else. He was a rebel intent on breaking American imperial power in the Middle East, democratizing Saudi Arabia and giving the wealth of that region to its people. See what I mean about knowing how the story would end? That's obviously not the ending that we got. He loses and goes to Lebanon and makes his money. And so, if we're going to tell it like a real story, you've got to do two things. Imagine you don't know the ending. And imagine that the story I'm telling you isn't just literally true, but something that we can rewrite and re edit. Okay? So, imagine the first scene being 1938, the Arabian Desert. Like retro quality Pathé newsreel, black and white. A man with a very polished mid Atlantic accent talks over something that sounds like the theme tune from Lawrence of Arabia. This is Dhahran, a desert city built by American ingenuity and Arab hospitality. The camera picks out two happy looking Arab men. A simple people, the voiceover says, a way of life unchanged for thousands of years. And then, kicking through the cliched Orientalist strings, the opening riff from Sid Vicious's My Way, hard cut from the archive. A camera swoops through the desert and through Dhahran. From the manicured lawns of the whites-only quarter, it accelerates through tennis courts, whites-only drinking fountains, out into the cardboard city of the colored quarter. It lands on an extreme close-up of a young boy's iris. In the eyes of Abdullah Tariqi's 12-year-old eye, we see reflected the whole oil camp, its racial stratification, its burning towers, its American flags, its Saudi secret policemen. Second scene, Texas, 1950. Eddie Cochran's Come On Everybody plays over a crackling car radio. The 22-year-old Tariqi rubs his sweaty palms together. It's not the Texas heat that's bringing the moisture up, but the two white men outside the cinema. His white date is in front of the cinema entrance arguing with two white men, telling them he isn't a Mexican or anything else. He's an Arab, which means he's a Caucasian, apparently. Not a word he has heard before, and in any case, the argument is short. Arab, Mexican, or anything else, he's not getting into the cinema. As he drives her home, he tells her about Dhahran, about his dreams, asks her if she wants to see it with him one day. Third scene, 1955, Aramco-colored camp, Dhahran, a large tent-like structure, 6 Arab workers watching their first film, a white man at the back keeping a precise eye. On the primitive projector, John Wayne swaggers through an artificial Texas desert that looks as plastic as a shop window selling outdoor wear. Wayne pulls out a shotgun and shoots dead 3 Comanche who, to the white man, look awfully like the Arabs watching the film. The Arab workers cheer Wayne. The white man breathes a sigh of relief. He gives a message to an Arab boy to take to the office. Don't worry, it says. They think they're the cowboys. Fourth scene, 1962, Riyadh. An Egyptian violin line sweeps down, and the crisp Darbuka rhythm of Kulthum's Auf Layla Wa Layla starts up. A camera follows a Mercedes at street level through dust streets full of Arab men and women in traditional clothes. It stops. From the back door, two well-dressed American men exit and walk onto the street. The first checks the address. The Aramco executive offers the man from the State Department a cigarette. They smoke. Tariqi, now oil minister, sits in his office. Second floor. A fan spins slowly overhead, dragging a slow rhythm. The radio is reporting news from the palace. The fall of Tariqi's allies. Coded, of course, but he knows what it means. His junior minister turns to him. Escape plans are ready. The Americans enter. Mr. Tariqi, says the man from the State Department, I hope we can find a way out of this regrettable misunderstanding. I don't think you misunderstand me at all, answers Tariqi. The State Department man is polite but firm. Unfortunate circumstances, historically close ties. This is America he's dealing with, not the British Empire, but he must understand Arabs are not ready for technical jobs. This is going to be open to the oil ministry. And besides, the new king himself has just been on the radio laying out how the talk of unmanaged democracy is a communist plot. The conversation is long and convoluted, of the kind made by diplomats or gangsters, people who know lives and fortunes turn on the use of a word. Mr. Tariqi, we and the US government are determined to help the people of Saudi Arabia reach a modern stage of development, but the facts are clear. 40 years ago, the first king of this country drew up a contract with us. A deal is a deal. For the first time in front of these men and his, Tariqi loses his temper. We are the sons of those Indians who sold you Manhattan, and we will renegotiate our deal. You know how it ends. A montage, a shimmering opening riff of this Rolling Stones' Gimme Shelter, Palace Coup. Repentant princes bending the knee to a new king. Aramco executive giving lists of names to Saudi Arabian secret policemen. Desert thugs arriving outside the shacks of trade union organizers in the colored camps. Then OPEC. Deserts made to bloom with sovereign wealth funds wherever oil is produced. The integration of 1,000 riyads into the global market. Dictatorships. Some decrepit monarchies. Some Republican generals making coup d'etats. Gangster economies where closeness to power is capital, greater and greater consumption. An oil-producing city in the global south. It could be Baku in the Caucasus, Pitaqua in Nigeria, Basra in Iraq. In the eyes of a young girl, you see reflected a city, a country, and a world. Abject poverty and ruthless violence in support of the destruction of the world. Jagger's banshee voice sings the first line. It's time for a new deal. Thank you.
Thank you, Julius. It's always weird to be in Zoom space to applaud, but thank you very much for sharing that with us. I love this play. And while you're here with us, I wanted to ask you, since we are talking about how we as artists can engage with climate, I'd love for you to share, what motivates you to engage with this issue in your work.
Yeah. So I'm Julius, everybody. I'm from Miami, Florida, originally born and raised, and I find it very terrifying and a bit surreal that many climate scientists predict, or many people just predict that by the year 2050, many parts of my own hometown won't even really be inhabitable, which to me, that just really kind of brings this issue into stark urgency. But I think the thing that is even worse is that this is a problem that much of the world's global south is going to be facing. It's not just something that's exclusive to the southern part of Florida. So I think, of course, I feel that fire, to do whatever I can in my capacity as an artist to raise people's awareness. But I think that, I just think that it's really important. This is really important work. And so, of course, I applaud everybody for doing it here. Yeah.
Well, and applause to you as well. Thank you again for sharing that with us. And I'd now love to welcome the panelists to join us here to discuss what we as artists can do, or the role that the arts can play in facilitating the energy transition. So yes, I'd love to welcome Joan and Toba and Alex, and I'll just do brief introductions here. So Toba Perlman leads NRDC, the Natural Resource Defense Council's work on renewable energy expansion in the Midwest, which encompasses wind, solar, storage, transmission, and grid design. And she's previously worked at Tesla and at Solar City. And Alex Nathanson is a multimedia artist, designer, technologist, and educator. And his work explores both the creative and traditional applications of sustainable energy technologies. And Joan Sullivan is a photographer who has documented the construction of some of the largest utility scale wind and solar projects in North America, and also writes the Renewable Energy series for the Artists in Climate Change platform. And I will welcome you all to share more about your work in greater depth. But to begin with here, I wanted to begin by having all three of you share a bit about how you see the role of the arts and culture in the energy transition, or if more relevant, how your work engages with the energy transition. And Toba, I might offer that to you first to ground us in the sort of policy and advocacy stakes of where we are.
Sure. Hi, thank you for having me, and thank you for letting me sit in on this, the one-man play. It was really amazing. I think where we are is, it's a story of progress. I think that there's a lot of hope and optimism about where we were and where we are going, but it's a question of at what pace and what speed. And unfortunately, the speed that we're going will not, protect us from the most severe impacts of climate change, whether that's, you think it's 1.5 degrees Celsius or 2, we're just not meeting the pace that we need to be at as far as development and expansion of renewables. And as far as how important the arts are in this, I think they're really critical. I think I deal with a lot of talking about what renewables might look like in the Midwest in my current role, but have done this work both at the national level and internationally, working at the United Nations Environment Program. And it's all about how you identify these, whether you see these as a good thing, as a beautiful thing, as a part of what we think our future is, or if you see them as blocking your fields or your view from your home and, looking over the ocean. I think it's really important. And as you mentioned, Thomas, you talked about the idea of a coal worker. When I lived in Washington, D.C. for a long time, there were always these pictures of these coal miners in the subway stations there. They were very attractive coal miners by all accounts, probably paid actors, but they had some dirt on their face. They looked like they had just come out of a mine, and some very plush mine. And that is part of the identity, part of the story that they're telling. And I don't think that we necessarily have done that for renewables in the same way.
Thank you. And I think that gives us sort of a well, thinking about how renewables can be beautiful gives us perhaps a natural transition into Alex, if you'd like to share a bit about your work and how you engage with renewables.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think there's a huge amount of ways artists can engage with them. I mean, maybe two sort of things that I like to think about a lot are, one is we know that the scale of the energy transition is going to far exceed pretty much any other infrastructural changes we've ever attempted as a society. And we need to be aware of the design part of that. Infrastructure impacts our mental well-being, our physical well-being, just about everything. And so artists and designers and other creative individuals need to sort of be aware of those technologies and be able to engage with them from an early stage, right? I mean, it's my sort of position that artists should be, there should be an artist in residence at NREL. There should be artists, engaging with these technologies from the lab. And as they grow, they'll be more holistic and more sort of attuned to fitting in with our culture in a way that is sort of healthier. And then I think the other part of that is there's just a lot of gray area within this transition, and particularly around issues of like resiliency and things that the traditional solar industry, or I mean, solar is sort of where my expertise is, but also the wind industry and other industries don't really, want to engage with. And I think artists historically operate in these sort of gray areas of our world in various ways, a lot of ways involving infrastructure, actually. And so I think there's just a huge amount of opportunities there for addressing a lot of need in sort of infrastructural changes.
Great, thank you. And also, we can also save this to later, but if you'd like to share images of your work now, I think that could be, so folks can get a sense.
I can definitely do a quick little run through of some stuff. Let's see. Cool. So I've got a ton of slides queued up in case, I need a visual. So I'm just going to jump ahead to some artwork, but let's see. Yeah, so just to start with, a lot of my work, it ranges from very practical to a lot more sort of expressive. And I sort of, work in a bunch of spaces, from art and design and education, and also engineering to some extent. And all those things sort of really interact with each other and support each other in various ways. And so the more practical work I do really supports the more experimental work. And I think the more experimental work I do really supports my ability as like an educator and as a engineer and designer to sort of make systems that are accessible and approachable. So these three structures are integrated solar structures for schoolyards for the public school system in New York City. So this spring we're piloting these structures at 5 sites, and they're going to be functional demonstrations to support photovoltaic curriculum. So that ranges from middle school kids in a science class to high school kids training to maybe not go to college but go into the trades. So it's a wide range of potential students. This one on the right, I actually just finished installing like 3 hours ago. So yeah, but as an artist working with this material, I spent some time trying to reimagine what the cell could be. These are mosaics that are functional photovoltaic modules that are made with upcycled solar cells. These are some photovoltaic instruments. So this is some prepared violins on the left. So when light hits them, and this is performed in collaboration with other musicians and also a light artist. So when light hits the instruments, they sort of come to life, make sounds, make motions. This is a work called Solar Protocol, which is ongoing. It's a global network of small-scale solar-powered internet servers. Currently, we have nodes in Canada, the US, the island of Dominica, Chile, Australia, and I think we have a node in Kenya coming online soon. And this project, basically, essentially it's a website that serves traffic from whatever location on the world has the most sun at that moment, and sort of as an exploration of environmentally responsive infrastructure and low energy computing, things like that. And most of the last year of my life has been spent writing a book, which is coming out this summer, called A History of Solar Power Art and Design. So a lot of my work is really based in sort of, making these really crucial technologies more understandable and also tangible. And one of the things I sort of keep coming back to with the climate crisis is really, in a lot of ways, it's an issue of scale and perspective, and also a sort of lack of understanding of our history. So I think every industry is going to need to change, regardless of how central it is to sustainability. Art is no exception, and I think it's really important to understand the work that's been done before us, because that'll help inform the work coming after us and all that, and allows us to build sort of communities of practitioners and all these things. So this book grew out of my master's thesis, where I was sort of working on a database of solar powered art. And it quickly became clear that basically this space hadn't really ever been written down in any meaningful amount of detail. And there's all sorts of incredible work from just about every medium. And so this book is really just a way to bring all that stuff together in a way that hopefully reinforces or teases out some interesting ideas around the poetic qualities and sort of practical possibilities for working with photovoltaics in a creative context. But yeah, so that's the hyper quick version of my art practice. Yeah.
Wonderful, thank you. And I'm excited to dive into all of this more with you all. But Joan, if you want to share a bit about how your work has engaged with renewable energy, with the energy transition, and we'll share some of your photographs as you do.
Okay. Well, I thought I'd start off first of all by thanking Thomas and Chantal for inviting me here tonight. And I want you all to know it's really, really special for me to be here, because I live on a farm in a very rural area, 7 hours northeast of Montreal. It's just so wonderful to be part of this sort of global community of like-minded souls. And I'm just so grateful, because it's been a very hard year for all of us, but I'm really far away, and this is important for me to be with you. So I just wanted to start by kind of giving a background, because I'm a bit of an odd duck, okay? I've had a very unconventional career path, and I just want to simplify it for our viewers by saying I spent the first 50 years of my life focusing on finding solutions to global public health challenges, and mostly the HIV epidemic in Africa. And now I'm currently in my second 50 years focusing on trying to find solutions to the global climate crisis. And throughout both of those careers, I've always had a camera slung across my shoulder. So I've been taking photos since I've been 20 years old. I never went to art school, never went to photography. It's just one of those things you learn by doing. And I have to say that I've been extremely lucky. I've so often been in the right place at the right time. So on my 50th birthday, I decided it was time to move back to Canada from Africa. And that was about 15 years ago. So the transition for me to switch my camera from AIDS to climate was really easy. And a little bit of serendipity did help. I was sitting next to a very important person on an airplane in 2009. And this person later invited me to my first wind construction project pretty close to my home. And, bang, immediately I was hooked. I knew instinctively that I had found my little niche, in the large global climate change movement. So my career just took off, boom, without much planning or thought. I've been granted privileged access to some of the largest wind and solar construction sites, mostly in Canada, but a few in the United States. It's been great doing a lot of traveling, meeting people from all kinds of backgrounds, very different from my own. And I'm really, really enjoying my second career as an older woman. So I'll admit, in the beginning, I was seduced by the technology. I believed that clean technology was going to solve all of our energy problems. And I thought all I had to do was make pretty little pictures and I would change the hearts and minds of everyone who saw them. And how wrong I was. Sometimes I think I'm just literally shouting into the wind, and other times I'm preaching to the choir. And so you've caught me sort of in a transitional moment, an existential crisis of sorts, which has been greatly exacerbated by the COVID pandemic. We'll talk more about that later, but suffice it to say that I eventually realized that no matter how beautiful I could make a wind turbine or a solar panel look, I was never going to change someone who had already made up their mind that climate change doesn't exist or that wind turbines were a blight on the landscape. And over time, you know, the negative feedback that I got from some people who truly hated wind turbines, it had an impact on me as a photographer, and it made me question what I was doing. So it was no surprise when my initial love affair with turbines began to fade. It's kind of like any old love story, right? But what saved me was that I realized there was a much more interesting story right in front of my eyes. And that was the men and the women who are building our post-carbon infrastructure. Their stories of their own personal transition from the oil fields to renewable energy construction sites is fascinating. And for all you poets and musicians and playwrights out there, this is really a very rich source of very human stories, some quite tragic, all visceral. And I just love to collaborate with anyone who wants to dive deeper into what I've started calling the human transition within the larger energy transition. So I'll stop there for now.
Thank you, Joan. And I guess I wanted to now just sort of open it up to conversation on these, but I'm thinking, Toba, I'd be curious from your perspective, and you alluded to this some with the sort of the cultural power of images of fossil fuel workers and that kind of thing. But what, from an advocacy perspective, what narratives around clean energy are missing? What things sort of feel like they could be in the cultural space that aren't, that people don't know how to emotionally relate to, or that you find in your work?
Yeah, well, there's a lot. I mean, I think the renewable industry in the beginning, in particular solar, was primarily white. It was a bunch of people who started off putting it on their homes and actually moving away from the grid, just totally cutting wires. And that was how the tech started, and it's developed from there and it's expanding from there. So I think making it look more like us, like as everyone, is a big piece of this. I also think there's a real power issue, figurative power. Sorry, I always need to clarify that on one of these conversations, where for people who their land will be used either for renewables or transmission, they feel like they're not a part of the process in the same way I think they are as farmers, or even as, you know, if they were miners or something like that. There's something missing from that story where they feel like they're part of the solution. So I think that's a big part of it as well. And then the other piece that I would say is actually this other side, which we're not talking about with renewables, but is much more hard to kind of pin down, which is like some of the technologies like energy efficiency and even talking about electrifying your home. These are harder to kind of understand versus a big piece of technology, like a wind turbine is somewhat similar to a big power plant, where I think a smart thermostat or sealing your windows, really critical, really important, has all these benefits, is important to getting to 100% clean energy, but is a much harder story to kind of visualize and tell.
Absolutely. And then I guess directing that same question to Alex and Joan, I mean, do you find that in interacting with people through your work that you see sort of perceptual changes around clean energy? Alex, in your education work?
To some extent, yes. I don't think so. Most of the people that I'm engaging with in sort of educational contexts are not they're like very open to, well, one, they acknowledge climate change. They're very open to basically any sort of climate related pro energy transition position. So I think that's a huge difference, right? Like their perception, I think, is already generally positive. I think it's interesting when I'm dealing with, I work with a very wide range of people from both ages and skill sets. So like, when I'm like maybe, dealing with like a high school kid in New York City who maybe is like just old enough to sort of remember Hurricane Katrina, like maybe, sorry, not, oh my God. But not Katrina, obviously, but, just our local sort of environmental changes here and our sort of experience. I think that's a very different thing because they're sort of at this point where like maybe they haven't experienced the impacts of climate change directly. Slightly older New Yorkers have experienced Sandy and sort of have that sort of visceral understanding of the impact. So I think, my work, I guess, as an educator, I think I don't feel like I'm changing perceptions as much as I'm making people more comfortable with it. And also giving people like the opportunity to then be able to engage in more substantial conversations around it other than just being in favor of it, right? Like, even if I'm making a small like solar powered noisemaker and maybe it's just a solar cell directly wired to like a piezo and so it makes a beep when it's in the sun, someone can make that. One, they've touched the thing and so all of a sudden they have a very different sense of what it is because it's not just like a shiny blue thing, it's like a thing that they probably broke accidentally and I had to give them a new one because it's they're wafer thin, right? And it's fragile and it's expressive and there's all these sort of things to it that all of a sudden, like that sort of was what maybe changes for them. And then they understand the limitations because if it's a cloudy day and I'm doing a class, maybe we really have to hold this thing like right up to a clamp light because there's not enough ambient light or something like that. And so those sort of things, I think that's sort of the area where like I explore, I think I am able to sort of grow perceptions, but not change them directly so much. Yeah.
That makes sense. And then I guess, Joan, I was definitely hearing a resonance between your shift in focusing on the human transition and what Toba was saying about, the people that are associated with or were at first associated with renewable energy technology. I wonder, I guess, what motivated that transition in your work and if you wanted to talk more about that.
When I first sort of jumped into renewable energy, as I said, it was sort of like this, serendipitous opportunity. I had to educate myself. I spent hours and hours on Twitter following scientists and inventors and everyone writing about renewable energy. So I became very sort of like techno. And as I wrote in my last blog for Artists and Climate Change, there's this one line where I say, technological infrastructure alone does not an energy transition make. What's missing is this human side. Like, how are we changing because of all of this great, new technology, which I love. But I was feeling like my photos were just not digging deeper. So I want to present my favorite book. And, Alex, I'm looking forward to reading your book, but I strongly recommend Barry Lord's Art and Energy, How Culture Changes, because he not only does he talk about energy transitions across history, and there have been several, okay? This is not the only one humanity's ever lived through. But what he's saying is this particular energy transition is special. It's about stewardship. Okay, the era of oil was about consumption. The era of renewables is about stewardship. And when you think about it from an artistic point of view, stewardship is about people. It's about culture, and it's about collaboration. So I'm really interested in diving deeper into those sides of the energy transition. As much as I love the turbines and the geothermal and the panels and the Teslas, it's that human stuff. And I think that's why I did a plug for, musicians and poets and playwrights. There's a lot of rich stuff there that needs to be explored.
I guess I think I'm hearing something that there has been a challenge in telling those human stories related to renewables. For any of you who would want to jump in on this, how do you explain that difficulty, or what's the source of reticence to telling stories that connect humans to renewable technologies?
Anyone else want to go? I have this theory, like I honestly have been very disheartened by how many people have either come up to me during an art exhibit or harassed me on social, talking about, how much they hate wind turbines. And I'm starting a new little experiment, and you all should try it yourself. And instead of asking the question, why do you not like turbines so much? I'm turning the conversation around, and I'm saying, what are you for, right? You can't be against everything. You can't be against pipelines, against turbines, against solar. What source of energy do you prefer to use to charge your cell phone or your new shiny car? And I've noticed that when you put that question, what are you for? There's always silence. And then, not always, but more and more, you get this sort of raw emotional response, which is about the fear of change. People are afraid of letting go of what they've known all their lives, which is a fossil fuel culture. It's been great. We've had a great run, and we better the hell, stop it. But I think people are afraid. It's like a drug. It's like cutting the umbilical cord. They're afraid. And I understand that. But I think the whole thing about causing cancer and killing birds, that's not really it. There's something much deeper. They're afraid of change. We got to go there.
Yeah. I mean, I think to build off that, I think a lot of the energy transition we're talking about, it's more complicated, just in some basic technical levels, and also some political one. There's a lot. It's a sort of more nuanced thing, right? So even if we're talking about wind, and I'm a huge fan of wind farms, but there are important things around indigenous rights relating to wind farms, and all sorts of really complex issues that do complicate the narrative, right? Because I do think those of us who are in favor of action on climate, we are also tend to be in favor of accuracy. And I think that's a difficult thing. And so, like, for example, in my work, I really focus on functional photovoltaics as opposed to like speculative or sort of decorative things, because I feel like the second I get into anything, speculative, all of a sudden, no one will understand my work, because then it's like, well, does it work or doesn't it work? And so for me, that sort of is like an important line I have to walk in the way I sort of, bring these things out. Yeah. And I think the other part of that is just that it's sort of, there's just been so much money in sort of putting out just inaccurate sort of, so much both sidesism and so much sort of anti-climate change rhetoric that really dilutes the issue. around things just like reliability and things like that I think, we have to really wade through.
Yeah, I might actually push back a little bit on the idea that it's more complicated, because it's only more complicated because we built this other system, right? We relied on the idea that there's a central power plant and all these wires extend out from that central power plant. And so we're fighting against a system that wasn't designed for what we actually think of now, which is more of a distributed system where there are loads of power in various places. In a lot of ways, that makes a lot more sense. Like you can pull power from any side of the continent. You can have redundancies that can be resiliency. And so I think it really is this idea that this is the way we had it. And so we feel good about it, and we're scared of that change. And that change is hard. And I think we're kind of, at least in the United States, in a point where we're scared of big, ambitious goals, right? We've lost a little bit of that. And so I hope that this, including the Green New Deal or other conversations like this, is a way to kind of regain that idea and that spirit that I think has been dampened a little.
To that point, are there narrative stories around renewables that you think have been particularly successful or like particularly sort of politically effective, I guess, in counteracting some of what Alex was talking about, which is perhaps a sort of a negative predisposition towards that kind of change?
I don't know. I don't have a good answer. Anyone else wants to go?
I think Toba might be frozen.
Start to build these. The other place where I would see this is also, in particular, in environmental justice communities that have essentially been harmed by the fossil fuel industry for so long, being able to create their own power and do it in a way that they get to actually decide and feel in control and have some ownership of it. So those are two places where I've really seen those narratives be effective and start to kind of change how people think about it. And I think Alex's work is right. Touching it, feeling it, even just seeing it in your neighborhood makes it real in a way that if it's far away, it feels like something for someone else.
I think we might have missed the first part of your answer there. I don't know if others did. I heard the second point about in environmental justice communities, community-controlled power generation. But did others miss that first point as well?
Sorry, my a terrible mic on my work computer, and I apologize.
No problem.
My first answer was about the connection between labor unions and building renewables. A lot in the United States is focused in particular on the utility scale side. The really large stuff is with labor unions. And I think that's a way that we're starting to see that narrative change, where, workers from trades can really start to work on these in a way that I don't think it wasn't at the scale and size it is now. So we're starting to see that change. And frankly, the unions want these jobs and advocate for these jobs in a way that I think is really important.
I'd like to follow up on what Toba just said. Here in Canada, there's a great group called Iron and Earth. They're based in Alberta. And basically it's former and current oil and gas industry workers who are lobbying and training themselves to transition to help build Canada's green infrastructure. And there's just, it's been covered by the American press. It's gaining, power and visibility here in Canada. I think they are doing such a great job. I'm so proud of them. And if you haven't heard of them, they do have a great website, Iron and Earth. Wonderful story.
I think, yeah, I would just say, add to that, is that I think community solar in New York City in particular has sort of been rolled out and grown as a sort of possibility really, really well. Like, I think just the sort of communication around it has generally been handled well. And just this idea that you can sort of, there's a few different models, but like sort of, even if you don't own your home, sort of buy into a solar farm that balances out through the renewable energy credits and yada, yada, yada. But I think that sort of system has been well branded, for lack of a better word. Yeah.
Well, I'm starting to see some questions in the chat. So I want to take some time or shift it towards addressing those. And if other folks do have questions for our panelists, please put those in the chat as well. But welcome, Julia. Julia is one of my colleagues with the Arctic Cycle, the artistic producer. And Julia, yes, if you want to take it away with some questions from the chat.
Thank you, Thomas, and thank you, panelists. Getting a lot of affirming comments in the chat that these are conversations that we need to be having. Question first for Toba and Alex from Michael about how to use the arts to change the narrative of performative masculinity in US politics, like the debate over hard versus soft infrastructure with regard to American Jobs Bill that's in Congress.
Alex, do you have an answer first? That's a hard question.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a hard question. Pun intended, I guess. I don't know. I mean, I feel like, for me, so much of my work is education based. And I think because of that, it needs to be accessible. And I think accessibility is sort of antithetical to the performative masculinity that you're sort of referring to. So I guess that sort of is how I respond to that in my own practice is through that avenue, but I don't necessarily think that's like broadly, I don't think that scales up to, this across the US. But yeah, I don't know. It's definitely our culture has a lot of problems, right? So right, that's I think what it comes down to is how do we address, how do we try to bring in sort of ideas around intersectionality into the work we do with climate, and try to build better cultures while building better infrastructures.
This is really practical and doesn't get to the root of it, but I think who you're training is really important. Who's coming up in the field? What do they look like? Who do they represent? What are their communities and cultures? So it doesn't solve the whole problem. I think generally humans want to build things. It's easy to see that. And I think that just kind of falls into this cultural story. But one, it is who we're training to do these jobs, and do they look more diverse than they have? And then two, maybe it's a solution for the arts to start to tell stories that look different, right? And start to push and question on this. So it's up to you all. Good luck.
Thank you both. Yeah, and also just a follow-up question on this topic of performative masculinity. Duncan asks about the rollout of the electric F-150 pickup as a response to performative masculinity, if anyone wants to comment on that.
Yeah, I mean, there is something to say for, in particular, I think electric vehicles, right? We started with a Roadster. That was the first, clearly meant to compete against Porsches. Rivian is a truck that can haul a trailer, and the F-150 being the epitome of this idea, and even an electric Hummer, right? That I think there's an electric Hummer out there now too. So there's a power dynamic there and a power struggle that we have to address this to a certain population. And so it's really about changing the power structure and questioning if that's the way we have to approach all of these things.
Yeah, well said. A question for Joan from David, who's also in Canada. What is a human transition story you would showcase about moving from one energy sector to another? Oh, I think you're muted.
There we go. Sorry. Well, I've I have my sort of narrow window on this. I've spent the last 10 years hanging around construction sites. So I've listened to a lot of these transition stories, and they're not all positive. Some have been extremely difficult for the energy workers leaving oil and gas and transitioning to solar and wind. But it's a story about hope, despite sometimes the economic and the domestic problems at home based upon losing a high-paying job. But that is sort of the myth, right? Because those high-paying jobs are cyclical, right? There's boom and bust periods in oil and gas. No one talks about that. So these workers have been thrown around, and now they're in quote unquote lower paying jobs, but they're stable, right? And there's so much activity going on. So there's hope in the men and the women that I talk to. And there's a lot of women. They are one step ahead of you and me. They have already taken that big step to change their careers, to change their way of life, and to build the future. So I don't know if I've answered the question, but it's so powerful to be around them. These are people who drive F-150s, the old gas kind. And they're, gung-ho. They want to do this, not just because they need a job, but because they want their kids to have a livable future. They are all telling me that. So yeah, it's economic, it's jobs, but they're serious about making sure that their kids can carry on. I'm just so inspired by some of these men and women, really, honestly. I hope that answers your question, David.
That's awesome. Thank you, Joan. And I think broadening out, and for all three panelists, when you look at the next 10 to 20 years, what gives you hope?
Hope. I think I'm totally convinced that, that renewables will dethrone fossil fuels. That is inevitable. The problem is it's not happening fast enough, as Toba mentioned. It's not happening fast enough in terms of the climate. But as in all previous energy transitions, as my favorite book will explain to you, there's an overlap. It can take decades. It can take centuries. And we don't want this one to take centuries. But the alternative energy source comes in, causes a rumble. People push back against it. But it's the artists. It's the often, as he writes, Barry Lord writes, it's often the artists who hear about it, who sense it, and who describe it first. And they're the ones who begin to change the culture and the social norms surrounding that new energy source. So I have a lot of confidence in what artists can do. I'm a little bit worried that it's not going fast enough for the climate, but it is going to happen. Whether it happens in our lifetimes or our children's lifetime, renewables will dethrone fossils. It's just a matter of time. That's my hope.
Yeah, I think to sort of, build off that response, I think my sort of general view on the way the art world responds to some of this stuff is generally, artists are always going to respond to things in their environment and what the materials that exist around them, right? So as renewables and infrastructural changes grow, artists will naturally, obviously not every artist, but a lot of people, an increasing amount of people will, gravitate towards these new materials and technologies and repurpose them to, creative ends. So I think artistically, that will sort of grow in proportion to the infrastructure. Whether that is, meaningful or whether that impacts the climate transition, I have no idea. And I think, I feel like we have to be optimists, because we don't have a choice. But, I feel like if we look at where, I mean, for me, like some things that I feel like are big markers of whether or not we'll actually be in a better place environmentally or 10 to 20 years from now, or like issues around supply chains for sustainable energy and things like that. And like battery costs to some extent, but that, you know, smarter people than I have told me that's sort of inevitable to come down. But I think, you know, issues around like manufacturing and supply chains for these really crucial technologies is a huge issue, and how we can scale them up. And then workforce training. And so that's not an art answer so much. That's just like a, you know, I mean, I'm involved in a lot of workforce training for solar. And so I have some familiarity with just that ecosystem. And, you know, there's just a lot of logistics that have to happen to train the, like, I don't know, hundreds of thousands, if not, like, I heard someone say the other day, like 1 million, I don't know if that's true, but like 1 million electricians are needed to bring us to where we need to be just in the US, something like that.
Wow.
That's what I heard. I don't think that's probably true. Probably a few 100,000, but it's a lot, right? It was, yeah, it's a huge number. Anyway, so for me, those are sort of some of the benchmarks that, like, as a, I don't know, I would consider myself a very informed non-scientist, maybe. So that's sort of my caveat, I guess, on anything I say. But yeah, so I guess, you know, that's sort of a non-answer to that question, is like, fingers crossed. Yeah.
I think to build on that, I think the tech will get there. I think whatever's missing from the technology right now, I would say, like, it's long duration storage that can be charged for more than 4 hours, is a tech place we need help with. I think it'll get there. And I think something that I've witnessed, is that 10 years ago, maybe we were talking about the grid could handle 30% renewables. We know that now. We're talking about 50%, that's conservative, 75%, 80, 90, to how do we get to 100? So I think it's totally feasible from a tech perspective. So that's a piece of it that gives me hope. That's the more practical piece. I think generally the conversation has shifted, that we're seeing it in a way everywhere, not just in the United States, but elsewhere, where people are really talking about this issue, young and old, and those in power have to at least respond to it. So that gives me hope as well. And then the other piece, I think, is really from a younger generation, with things like the New Deal and the Green New Deal and the Sunrise Movement, talking about it more comprehensively, not just thinking about installing the panel itself or the turbine, but how that's made, who installs it, where it goes, the cradle to grave life of these things, where we really start to think about it from a comprehensive perspective. That makes me think we'll be in a better position than we were when we made the original electricity transformation, when we started to use coal plants and things like that. So those are probably my top 3.
Thank you, everybody. We're just a few minutes past 8 here on Eastern time, so a few minutes past the hour wherever you are. So I want to stop us here and say thank you to Thomas and to our 3 panelists for the great conversation. Thank you, Julia. Thank you, Julius, for such an amazing reading of the play. And Julius, if you want to turn your camera on so we can see you and say proper goodbye. In the background, we have Sierra, who has been helping us with all the technical aspect of it. So thank you, Sierra. If you want to participate in Climate Change Theater Action, you can visit our website. All the performances are happening in the fall. Anybody can jump in and put up an event using some of the plays, including the play that was presented tonight. And our next conversation will be on June 5th, and we're doing a university meetup. So anyone who has participated in Climate Change Theater Action or want to, that is associated to a university and would like to know what other universities have been doing or want to collaborate with other universities, please come and we'll try to facilitate connection. So thank you again, and we will see you soon. Good night.